Hey, this is Alan Stein, Leadership Performance Coach, and you are listening to Success is a Choice with Jamy Bechler.
Providing insights to help you grow your business, improve yourself, and add value to those around you. You're listening to the Success is a Choice podcast, where you get a peek into the lives of industry leaders as they share their stories with you.
Welcome to Success is a Choice podcast. I'm your host, Jamy Bechler, and today we have a special guest. He is one of the people that inspired me to get into podcasting. He has done over 800 episodes on his Tao of Sports podcast. He has been in the college sports and professional sports business for a long time. He's a much sought-after business consultant for sports, and he's also a keynote speaker at many conferences across the country. Troy Kirby, welcome to the show today.
Well, thank you, Jamy. And first of all, I'm glad that you finally decided to do the podcast yourself, because when I had you on the podcast, that was one of the first things I said right after is, man, I think you got to have your own, because you are pretty definitive in not only what you say, but your voice carries a lot and you're robust in your thoughts. And I think that's a good start.
Yeah, people like you were very instrumental in getting that ball rolling and kind of giving me some aha moments and giving me some advice through this. So I appreciate that. You know, you've had over 800 episodes, Troy. That is amazing. That is a number that I'm sure a lot of people have not even come close to reaching. What are some common themes that you've identified in your guest for what has made them successful and what has made them good at whatever it is that they do?
I think that the majority of the time, anybody who is at the top is still asking the questions of how to improve. And that, to me, is something that young people especially need to hear, but also their peers that are of the same level. So if you're taking the director level or the VP level or even the president level, if they're still asking those questions, it allows other presidents who are listening, other vice presidents who are listening to say, you know what, that's okay that I don't know that. Now I can, foster on, because one of the biggest challenges that we have in the sports industry, and this is on the sports sales side, this isn't necessarily always the athlete side or the coaching side, but, it might kind of cross over, is I think sometimes it's the hubris or it's the illusion of ego, because you don't want to look like you don't know what you're talking about, because if you do, well, this is not really that type of industry that kind of allows that. But if you hear other people essentially being vulnerable in how they speak about things and their thoughts and their concerns, how it comes to revenue generation, how it comes to development, compliance, those types of issues, even down to handling coaches or even working with coaches, even working with jobs, I think what happens is other peers in your industry go, wow, you know what? I've thought that way too, but I never felt that there was an outlet. And we're such a small industry that to me is something that if you can foster discussion, and hopefully the podcast has done that, that really is the benefit there.
You have worked with obviously tons and tons of people in the sports industry, but you've also worked with business executives and people in the business industry. You mentioned that in the sports industry, in particular, sometimes they don't want to ask for help or they don't want to appear vulnerable. Do you find that is the same in business, or is it slightly different?
I think everybody has, a make it up as you go along philosophy sometimes. I mean, there's a recent comedy clip that I saw from Joe Rogan, who is a comedian, who mentioned that he found it amazing that now that he's an adult, he realized that a lot of adults really are still, trying to make it up as they go along as well, as much as we like to pretend. And I think in the executive suite, while we may have those people who will not tell you that, they think they've got it figured out, technology is what changes it. Distribution is what changes everything. So nothing that, if I took somebody from the 1950s as a top executive and I placed them today in 2017 in a business, there is no way that they would be able to handle the amount of interaction that is required of a CEO, the amount of emails, the amount of detail, the amount of things that you now have to worry about. Before you used to be able to put out a press release and maybe the news media would pick it up. Maybe somebody would ask a question. Everybody is their own media. And this is one of the biggest, examples of things changing. We have an entire presidential election that was built off of the idea of one campaign that I think was kind of run in the 1990s, or that version of it, and one of them that was run more on social media than anything else. I'm not trying to get political, but what I'm saying is that the different gravitas to where the executives and, how they're actually viewed and what tools they use completely changes up who they are. And I think that assuming that you know it all and that you have it all figured out really does not benefit you in the long run because you're not learning.
That's a great point. Lots of experts have said, leading is learning. Leaders learn those kind of things. And you're absolutely right. The whole social media aspect is a whole new dynamic that, you see a lot of businesses falling behind with technology, social media. So the ones that are getting ahead right now, it seems like, are the ones that are embracing that and embracing change and being able to adapt. With your episodes, what has been some of your most memorable interviews or something that maybe has surprised you that a guest said or a direction that an interview took?
Well, I've actually had some of the folks that are not just the leaders in the field, but considered some of the legendary folks, right? So the Pat Gallaghers are one, who are marketing director, or, you've got, really John Spolstra is a huge one, Rob Cornelis, folks like that normally folks outside of the sports industry would not know about. But if I use those names internally with sports executives, wow, that gets a lot of feedback. And the thing is, the theme that keeps coming from out is that they're still learning too. And that they can rely on the old, sayings that they've had, or the old, kind of, I guess, old war stories that they've used. But that's not going to help them in 2 years, 3 years. And so even the John Spolstras of the world are still trying to figure it out. And I think that that's important because it allows people to say there is no one size fits all. Now, there are some folks that I think came in and absolutely blew it out of the water. I thought you did great with yours. But Mary Lou Tyler was one that she's more, she's predictive prospecting, and she is of the mindset, she's training folks that are in the real estate industry. But the things that she said about CRM and the things that she said about data prospecting and acquisition were mind blowers, simply because when we get into a small industry, we start to only think a certain way, and we start to only use a certain amount of tools because everyone's using them, and that's what we hear. So when you take somebody outside of that in the real estate industry and they're prospecting on the whole idea that they don't get paid at all if they don't close that house. So they need as many people to walk through that house as possible, not just to have somebody buy it, but to start a bidding war. So how do you cultivate? How do you do those things? To me, that's where, it can be a real mind blower for folks that are looking for new group sales leaders or new premium leaders. And that's been something, especially in the last, say, 10 years, ever since the economy crashed, things have changed for sports. It used to be that you could count on your giant corporations in the city or town to be able to gobble up all those luxury suite boxes, do it on a 10-year contract, no big deal. Hey, this is what we got, corporate sales, whatever. And all of a sudden, they started looking, those companies, well, where's the ROI in this? Well, we need a justification for this. Anybody that gets invited, how do we do that? And it totally changed up the mindset. And it's changed ever since to where now it's forced the hand to look outside the box. And that's been beneficial for sports, which for so long had never looked outside the box at all.
And you mentioned, the housing market crashing for real estate and also hurting investments and big brands and things like that, different challenges that athletic departments have faced. What have been some of the challenges that you've faced during your career, some of the lessons maybe you've learned and the ways you've been able to overcome some of those challenges or obstacles you faced?
Well, one of them was that when you're building your own brand, even if you're doing it on your time, sometimes your employer doesn't see that. And sometimes it becomes kind of an ego push because mainly they want to know why they're not the ones getting the calls or why anybody else knows your name compared to theirs because you're not of say, the same title status. And I've never subscribed to that. And maybe that's been dangerous for my career, but I'd rather live a little dangerously than not. But I've had those bosses, and I had one of those for 4 years that just was very, not happy about certain, things. When I would go to industry conferences and, they'd mention the name of the organization I worked for, they'd always refer to me, even though the athletic director could be standing right there and nobody would know who that person was. It's just the fact that I was more present. I was more active. Now, I'm also single. I have no kids. So it makes it a little easier to spend those extra hours doing those things. But it's also understanding technology. And sometimes as we get older, and I always use this as an example, the older folks that think they're being really coy by on their LinkedIn not putting up a headshot. I don't know that you're really doing anything for yourself, and you're really not, protecting yourself by not having your headshot up. But you'll see people do that, and then you'll see other people that really invest the time into making sure their LinkedIn has not only a headshot, some video, some different blog posts that they put up there, different interaction. And then when it comes time to, look at, who's the person that they're going to, recruiters are going to possibly look at to hire, that person without the headshot goes, well, wait, I've got the bigger resume. Yeah, but you're not out there. They don't see you. And that's a big component of it too. Yeah, I'm going to give you something that's going to blow your mind. And I mean, I'm sorry to say it this way, but it's true. We are in the version of the 1880s. And what I say by that is in the 1880s, when you had a guy that came to a printing town with a printing press, they were the media source for that town. Okay? Everybody now in the United States has the ability, if you have a phone, if you have technology, to be a printing press. Right now we're doing a radio show. Up until about 5 years ago, this was really non-existent. This medium of having the ability to record something, be able to put it out there, and be able to have people download it en masse if they wanted to. We would have had to buy airtime on a radio station and, probably on a Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon next to the real estate guys, and pay $300 or $500 in order to have it broadcast only to a small city of people. Now we can have it nationwide, internationally, whatever. I get Russians that actually listen to my podcast, people in Russia, people in China, people in Australia. To me, that is the biggest gravitas you can make, is that what you're doing now, you have the potential to have it go out to as many people as possible. So it's like the 1880s, to where if you were the ownership of the news, because you could produce a medium which was paper that people could see the news on, and it was more than rumor or fact, maybe it was both, I don't know, but you still had a wider reach. Well, that's what we have with Twitter. That's what we have with Facebook. That's what we have with video, Instagram, whatever. And the thing is, those who actually learn how to use those tools are the ones that people remember. And that, to me, is something that I think is valuable, and understanding it's not whether or not you're a great coach anymore. I don't think. I don't think it's whether or not you're a great CEO. I think it's whether or not you're a great CEO who can also have everyone aware of them. Give you a great example. I don't think Mark Cuban is that great of a basketball owner. But you know what? Everybody knows who he is. Not because he has $1 billion, but because guess what? He's on a reality TV show. He has a Twitter account. He's everywhere. He's, writing blog posts. He's a part of it. Could you name 5 other NBA owners that probably own 10 times the amount he does? Steve Ballmer is in technology and doesn't even do as much as, Mark Cuban. And I don't even know if people would recognize him as much. It just depends. So
you mentioned a lot about social media here in the last few minutes, and you even mentioned Mark Cuban, a normal person, not a billionaire, a normal person trying to build their brand. I imagine you'd say, use social media. What are some practical tips? What are some practical ways that they can increase their brand and bring some attention, become a person of interest, become a person of attention to grow their brand? And maybe they're not that person. You talked about you were in an athletic department where you weren't the boss, you weren't the athletic director, but your brand was still increasing. Maybe there's someone out there that is similar to you. What would be your advice for them?
Well, the first thing is have a point of view and be able to defend it at all times. And my point of view from the beginning was I focused on one area of the business. That does not mean that that's the only thing I talked about, but it's primary. So when you go to my social media accounts, you really see one primary thing over and over again, tickets. And tickets was something that nobody talked about, or if they talked about, they kind of barely talked about it. But I talked about the fact that, I don't believe in free tickets. I don't believe comping works. We talked about mini pack sales, season ticket sales, secondary market, pricing, things of that nature. Did my brand start overnight? No, but your brand is about what you're saying consistently and what people can count on. If I go to McDonald's, I'm not going to get a filet mignon, but I know that I'm going to get a Big Mac, and it's going to look exactly like a Big Mac should look. And I know that I'm going to get a large Coke, exactly like a large Coke should look. And those fries are going to taste just about the same. And I know that bothers some people because they think that that's sometimes that doesn't work because it seems like it's just kind of, a factory made. But what it's saying is there's a consistency to what your brand is, what your brand stands for. If I go to Starbucks, it's the same thing. There's two places that are stir-fry Asian places in the town I live. And they're owned by the same group, technically. One is a kind of a franchise off of the other one. And they're across town from each other. But the difference is they're two different tastes because there's no consistency of brand. And what happens is because there's no consistency of brand and because I've eaten at one of the places that just did not meet the standards, was not as clean, did not taste the same, in the type of food that I was used to, it affected how I felt about the other one that was doing it correctly. That makes sense. Yeah. So what you need to do is you need to be consistent. That doesn't mean that's all you talk about is the same thing over and over again. I also don't just put out my own blog posts and nobody else. I follow other people. I find people that are interesting to me. If there's somebody that's highlighting, something that I like, there is a woman for the 49ers who's doing a lot of great things with premium. Her name is Haley. And I just tweeted and said, you're doing a great job, blah, blah, blah. And hey, everyone kind of look at her. And she was like, wow, I couldn't believe you did that for me. And I said, if you're doing it correctly, I want to be a part of that. I want to be able to show my followers who, I don't have the hugest following. I only have like 4,500 followers. But the difference is that those 4,500 followers are passionate. I would rather have 4,500 followers that are uber passionate for what I want to do than 10,000 followers that really don't even look at what I do. And that's where, you see some people with their social media and they'll game the system and they'll buy followers. Are you really buying followers or are you lying to yourself on the exercise bike? That's another one. I could pay the $20 and not actually go exercise and just mark down that I did it and I did a mile a day. Well, that's what some people do with social media. They lie to themselves about what they're actually getting. When I tell people there are 15,000 people a month listening to my podcast, to me, I would rather be honest and open rather than them not getting the reaction that they needed, or rather them not understanding whether or not, this was just going to create this tidal wave of interest. And, how many people are on the email list. I can tell you, not only based on analytics, but I also follow how many people are actually, getting the 3 stars. And, I do something with the email list that I think is kind of interesting, and I'll share it with you. With my email list, I actually have it on a star system because it's through MailChimp. And if you get down to that 1 star, i.e. you're not interacting with it, it makes it so it doesn't send you that email. You don't go off my list. You just go in kind of a timeout chair. And the difference is a lot of times those folks suddenly will email me and go, hey, I ain't receiving this. Oh, I'll make sure you get it now. And that to me, it's a way to have them check back in with you and say that they still want it. Because I would rather not fill up their email box or their spam filter. And it helps me understand what I have. And, when I go to conferences, that's what people, oh gosh, boy, I read your email each week. This is whatever. I actually had some people that were kind of angry because I had stopped putting so many links in, for, outside stories. I mean, I was putting like a good 200 And I said the problem was that, it was clogging up emails or, it wasn't sending through. And it was actually got, people to actually check into my Twitter feed where I would put those links instead. So it actually helped me out in a way. But those are, some of the things. You have to build it where it's a loyal consistency. And the other thing is you have to make sure that you're not just doing it so you can sell a product to them, because you are that product. So, and that product needs to be something that they're consuming and buying because they want to, not because you're telling them to. I've never heard of anybody who's bought a product twice that had to be told to. They've only done it because they've wanted to.
We'll get back to Troy Kirby in just a moment. Troy interviews so many guests on his podcast that have such a strong influence over student athletes. This is so important because our student athletes are the future. We have come out with a new book entitled The Leadership Playbook, Become Your Team's Most Valuable Leader. It contains stories, insights, and practical tips on how to help student athletes become better leaders and teammates. When we positively develop our students, we can also help influence the future in a positive way. Frederick Douglass once said, "It is easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men." Please visit theleadershipplaybook.com to learn more. And now back to our interview with Troy Kirby. Well, switching gears on you, Troy, one thing I didn't mention in the opening intro about you is your hobbies or anything about your personal life, but you actually write, in addition to all the other stuff you do, you actually write for fun or write fiction. And you've written a couple books. I know your most recent is Liquid Courage, a crime novel. You wanna talk about that a little bit? I'm sure I would be very interested to hear about that, at least.
Well, this comes back to the 1880s argument. Before it used to be, when I grew up in the 90s, I graduated from high school about 93, 94. You had to, get an agent. You had to get an agent to convince a publisher, and then the publisher had to decide that they wanted to distribute your book. And to me, that blockage is why you don't see so many authors coming out of, the 1990s, 2000s that were of a different kind of fiction. You saw them only for, the widest possible audience, or they were doing memoirs, etc. And I'd always wanted to do something along those lines. So I challenged myself this last year to write, and, I'd always kind of had some of these ideas around, but had never really focused on them. And Amazon has the ability for me to lay out my own, books, have them edited, so I can have, because some of these big publishing houses have let go of their editorial and their design staff. So all those people are doing it DIY. So you can now hire somebody for $500 to do your cover. I have the guy that did Stephen King's covers for half of his paperbacks that's now doing my covers. So I won, and I mean, well, literally. And if you look at the cover, it's pretty cool. But I mean, I was like enamored by it. But then, I have professional editors who have done it for major books. So it's not like I got somebody down the street doing it and, whatever. But I did it as a challenge to myself, and I wanted to work on the sport of bodybuilding, because I always find bodybuilding to be an interesting, it's kind of an unregulated thing. It's a little bit mysterious. I mean, Rich Piana, who was 46, just recently passed away, had been an open advocate of steroids as the only way that you could possibly do it. So in a way, it's almost this pervasive idea of cheating is the only way to win. And I wanted to kind of use that as the backdrop for people that were on that borderline. How do they kind of go about that, and what would make them decide to use, human growth hormone, and what would make them decide to go even further in order to supply that habit? So it's just something I had together for a while, and this actually comes into why you want to build up your social media followings, because so many of these folks will, build a book and then they'll let it sit there and maybe a few people will buy it. But I learned last year when I wrote a chapter, not a full book, but a chapter in a book about sports business analytics, to where I asked about 150 people if they would just click on a link and, retweet it and share it, and do the same, on Twitter, and do it on LinkedIn, and do it on Facebook. Out of that, we ticked off the publisher, it was actually a formal publisher, because it was around Christmas time and he kept having to restock the book because he wasn't used to that. So a good problem to have. But the thing is, I started looking at that and going, wow, well, maybe this is more legit than it, seems, because back in the day, it used to be that, if you went independent and you self-published, that really wasn't a thing, it was kind of frowned upon. And I've actually talked to one of my good friends who I've had on the podcast and interviewed a few times, is Chris Syme. And she used to do just sports social media stuff. And now she's gone into book social media. And she said, that doesn't even register anymore. There are people with major publishing contracts trying to get out of them simply because they know their followers will buy their books. They'll have more freedom and they'll be able to make more money. And I was like, okay. So it's been cool thus far. The official launch for the book is actually right after we, do this podcast, like in the next week. But the thing is that if I didn't have those set relationships with those folks, I couldn't count on them to retweet. I couldn't count on them to share. I couldn't count on them to like it. I couldn't count on them to, allow me to do that. That doesn't come over last week. I just put out a Twitter feed and I go, hey, everybody, I've got 2 followers on my Twitter feed. You should like me because, whatever. That's just not how it works. But people will do you favors because they have a relationship with you. They've built one. I mean, how many times have you seen it with basketball coaches to where, you're in the basketball world. Don't tell me that there weren't kids that they passed on, but they knew would be perfect for your program, that they didn't, make sure that you had the ability to see first. That's because you have a relationship with them. Social media is no different. It's just personal relationships through digital means.
Well, we'll make sure we put the link for your new book into the show notes so people can go and check that out and purchase that book. We want to do some rapid fire questions to finish it up. Just a few questions here, just kind of off the top of your head. A podcast or a book that you would recommend or are currently consuming?
The podcast that I really enjoy, honestly, is called Criminal. And I know that sounds coy that, I'm writing crime novels, but what I like is the media assessment about what a crime was compared to the real life of what crime actually happened compared to how people reported on it. And I find that to show that the subjective way that we look at things really matters, because sometimes we can be overly critical of something that doesn't deserve it, or we just kind of we don't even really kind of give it the due process it deserves. So I found that fairly interesting. And one of them was actually fascinating because it was about a Buddha statue that was in Oakland right when I was living down the street in Davis, California. So I actually got to go down and see it. And it was interesting to see the way it had cleaned up a neighborhood, just a small little statue from Home Depot, because of the religious implications. But yet the city was then deciding that despite all of the cleanup that had happened around this area because of this little Buddha, because people didn't want to dishonor this thing with old mattresses and, crime element and all the horrible things that were around it, the city decided to weigh in and said it was not up to structure or up to speed or whatever. So it was interesting to see how the perception of the community's, response and responsibilities compared to those that were above them in the political specter, kind of mattered. So to me, it was an exciting thing to be able to see that. And that's one of the things with podcasts, or books, if you have the ability to kind of see the frame of reference from where they're talking about, it makes it much more lively for you.
Who would be somebody that you haven't had in one of your episodes that you would love to have, kind of a big fish or your wish list of someone that you haven't been able to get on yet?
I would still like to get Mark Emmert on. I know that's going to be hard and tough because, I actually met him when he was the University of Washington president. I've made kind of those inquiries, but it's tough because he's an ESPN guy, or he's a kind of a big guy, and no matter what he does, he's president of the NCAA. It's probably a little bit, more difficult to get him because everyone's willing to pounce on anything he says. So it just depends. But that would always be a big fish that I would like to, kind of reel in one day if possible.
You've already mentioned MailChimp as something that you use for your email list, but what's a productivity tool or an app or a piece of software or resource that you really would have a hard time doing without, maybe other than a MailChimp?
TimeTrade. TimeTrade.com, please go to it. Pay the $50 a year. Your life will be changed. It allows you, and I actually think you use this when you set up the podcast with me, and I don't get a residual, so that's not why I'm doing it, but it's only $50 a year. I can't understand what their business model is, but what it does is allows my calendar to meet with your calendar, and see the available times. And then it puts in a thing for both of our calendars at the position in which they're there. And I think that to me is one of those software things. I'm always shocked that, I mean, I think there's a few others competitors out there, but they cost way more. And I still don't understand, their business model, but, at the same time, I'm shocked that more people don't use it because it saves me from having to write 30 different emails back and forth on what time, what date, etc.
Absolutely. And if you can make your life a little bit more efficient, you can save so much time. Everybody says we don't have time for this or that, but we spend so much time mismanaging our time and not being efficient.
That's another one, Asana, ASANA.com. It's free. It was actually made by people at Facebook, and they got frustrated because they could never make sure that their coworkers had finished, things or checklisted or whatever. And it allows you to do checklists. It allows you to do, actually adapt files and put those uploads so you can see the current file, whatever. But to me, when I use that tool every morning, sometimes I finish through my list early. And you know what I do? I go to the next morning's stuff. And I actually try to finish as much as that as possible because I would rather be ahead. So, that's one of the mindsets is being ahead with the podcast episodes. You wonder how 800 episodes come together. A lot of times I was positioning myself to where I was 10 to 20 episodes ahead before release. And they would be set to go because I might have a football game or I might have a basketball game. And I don't think that some people understand that if you put the time in early, it actually makes it easier for what you have to do later. And some people just can't wrap their brain around that.
That's awesome. It's an old Abraham Lincoln. If I had 6 hours to cut down a tree, I'd spend my first 4 hours sharpening the blade.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, how many times as a coach did you talk about conditioning and really work on it with your kids? And the ones who invested the time were the ones that didn't get winded about minute 36 compared to the ones who got winded at minute 25.
Troy, what would be one of your favorite quotes or things you like to say?
Good artists create, great artists steal. And that comes from Picasso, comes from Da Vinci, it comes from Bill Gates. Essentially what it means is you're going to take whatever you see and whatever you have, in your midst, and you're going to be able to create it for yourself. So if somebody's listening to this and they are somebody in the stock world, I don't know if there's anybody doing what I'm doing in the stock world. I think that would be fascinating to see if somebody ran a weekly email and a weekly podcast and, did those things. That might be a brand builder right there, or the music world, or, a few others. I'm always shocked to see that there are certain people that think that it's quote unquote stealing if you take a portion of an idea and just use it in something in a way that it was never used before. I mean, it's not like you're going to give me a residual anyway, but it's not like I'm the one that invented podcasting or emails anyway. So, go for it.
We'll finish up with this question. If not for doing what you do right now, what would be your dream job? What would be something that you would really love to do other than what you're doing right now?
I actually think that this is kind of fairly close to what I want to do. I mean, I enjoy the writing. I enjoy the other stuff, but I like the fact that, I'm able to use my mind. I'm able to consult with different businesses. People call me and, they'll pay me money to give my thoughts. And what was funny was, I worked for some organizations to where even though they would pay me, the last thing that they wanted was my thoughts. So, I actually got criticized about that once. They said, I got a review and one of them goes, well, you seem to be giving out a lot of great ideas, but, well, we don't see them utilized here. And I said, every time I've presented an idea publicly, I've always done it privately first. Well, yeah, but we chose not to do it. Well, sure. But so is that on me that you chose not to utilize my idea, so therefore it just stays with you? I always think that's kind of, goofy in a peer-to-peer session. But I think sometimes people just want to have the idea of, they would rather feel more impressed by stopping an idea than by encouraging it. And I just want to be in a world where they want to encourage my ideas. And if they don't take them, that's fine. But, then I can use them for somebody else.
Where can people connect with you if they want to reach out to you or if they want to listen and read your stuff? What's the best way to do that?
Okay, they can go to troykirby.com, which has the podcast itself, or sportstao.com. That's sportstao.com. Twitter is sportstao. By the way, the Tao of Sports, which is the name of it, actually comes from an interesting thing. I'll give you this little tidbit. I was actually walking through San Francisco with a friend lamenting about this and having this idea back in 2012. And there was a homeless gentleman who piped up and said, "You should call it the Tao of Sports. All things flow from within." Okay, so I gave him $25. So even though I give credit where it's due, I also paid for the rights, I feel. So I did my part.
Well, I appreciate your time today, Troy. We'll get all those links in the show notes, and I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on, and good luck with your podcast as well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you allowing me to be on yours.
Thank you for tuning into the podcast today. Troy Kirby has a wealth of knowledge from his time as a podcaster and interviewing so many thought leaders in the sports industry. And we have some excellent guests just like Troy lined up in the coming weeks to add value to your life. We hope that we can help maximize your success so that you can reach your potential. And we want to make sure that you don't miss a thing. So please just take a quick second to hit that little subscribe button so you get all of the upcoming episodes. Thanks so much. And until next time, remember that success is a choice. What choice will you make today?